Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something that's pretty essential to keeping us all, well, functioning.
Hmm, I wonder what that could be.
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking all about calcium regulation in the body.
Calcium?
You might think, oh, calcium, I already know all about that. Strong bones, got it. But trust me, we're going way deeper than that today.
Much deeper.
We're going to be using a physiology handout from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb, who's an associate professor of medical physiology.
Excellent source.
And we're going to be uncovering, just some really surprising things about how different hormones and organs all work together to keep this mineral in balance.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And I think we're both going to learn a lot today.
I'm sure I will. I always do on these deep dives.
So, it's true. We often take calcium for granted, but it really is a fundamental element in so many processes in our bodies.
Absolutely. So we're talking way beyond bone health here.
Right. Like, I know that it's crucial for things like nerve impulses and muscle contractions, too.
That's right, yeah.
But the thing that I find so fascinating is how precisely balanced those calcium levels need to be.
Oh, they really do. It's actually quite remarkable. We're talking about a very narrow range here.
Right. How narrow are we talking about?
9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter of blood. That's the sweet spot.
Wow. So a really tight margin for error.
Very tight. And so the body has to have some very, very intricate mechanisms to maintain that balance.
So that's what I'm curious about. If it's so vital to maintain this precise calcium balance, how does the body actually do it? Is there like a main control center or something for all of this?
Well, you can think of it like that. And the key player here is something called parathyroid hormone, or PTH for short.
PTH, okay.
And this hormone is produced by these tiny little glands called the parathyroid glands. They're actually located right behind the thyroid gland in your neck.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so PTH, you can think of it as the body's calcium guardian. It's always monitoring calcium levels and making adjustments to keep them right where they need to be.
So almost like a thermostat kind of thing.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. When calcium levels get too low, PTH kicks in and it's like, all right, time to raise the heat.
And when they get too high.
It eases off, says, okay, we're good here. It's all about maintaining that sweet spot, that balance we talked about.
Fascinating. So it sounds like PTH has kind of a toolbox for how it manages those calcium levels. So what are some of the ways it can actually increase calcium in the blood when it needs to?
All right, so let's open up that toolbox, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
So first of all, PTH can mobilize calcium from the bones. Think of this like withdrawing funds from a savings account, when you need to cover some immediate expenses.
Oh, I like that analogy. So it's like emergency, gotta pull from the reserves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then secondly, PTH can signal to the kidneys to hold on to calcium that would otherwise be excreted in the urine.
So it's like, don't let any of that precious calcium go to waste.
Exactly. Conservation mode. And then finally, PTH can actually boost the activation of vitamin D.
Oh, vitamin D, right.
Which, as you know, helps us absorb more calcium from the food that we eat.
Right. Okay, so it's covering all its bases, mobilizing reserves, conserving what's already there, and then maximizing intake. Pretty impressive for one little hormone.
Oh, it is. PTH is a real multitasker.
But what happens if, things go wrong and those calcium levels drop too low? I know you mentioned this word earlier, but tetany, right?
Tetany, exactly.
What happens then?
Well, that's when things can get a bit tricky.
Yeah.
Because tetany can actually range from being quite mild to, in severe cases, life-threatening.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we're getting into some serious territory here now. So what is actually going on in the body when someone has tetany?
Okay, so basically when calcium levels dip too low, our nerves and muscles become what we call hyperexcitable.
Hyperexcitable, what does that mean?
They're basically primed to fire. So it leads to those involuntary muscle spasms and cramps that you might experience.
Oh, so that's what's happening with those muscle cramps.
Exactly, yeah.
And I imagine there are quite a few things that can cause this to happen.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there are a number of potential culprits, so to speak.
So like what?
Well, for instance, one possibility is something called hypoparathyroidism.
Okay.
And this is where the parathyroid glands, for whatever reason, aren't producing enough PTH.
Oh, so not enough of our calcium guardian.
Exactly. Not enough of the guardian. Then you have things like kidney failure, which can also disrupt calcium balance.
Oh, right.
And then also alkalemia.
Alkalemia, what's that?
Well, alkalemia basically means that the blood is too alkaline.
Oh.
Or has a high pH, which can actually reduce the amount of calcium that's available for the body to use even if technically there's enough calcium present.
Oh, wow. So it's like having money in the bank but not being able to access it.
Exactly. A perfect analogy.
And you also mentioned vitamin D deficiency earlier.
Right. Well, that, of course, can be a major contributor to low calcium levels.
So those are some of the things that can cause it, but what are some of the telltale signs that someone might be dealing with tetany? Should I be worried if, I get a random muscle twitch here and there?
Well, it's important to distinguish between the two main forms of tetany, latent tetany and manifest tetany.
Okay, so two different types.
And latent tetany is the more subtle form. So you might just experience those, kind of muscle twitches or cramps, especially during times of stress or if you've been doing some physical exertion.
That's so fascinating. I never realized that there could be a connection between like emotional stress and, our muscles actually physically functioning.
Oh, it's a very real connection.
Is there like a physiological explanation for that?
Oh, absolutely. So stress, triggers a whole cascade of hormonal responses in the body.
Right.
And some of these hormones can actually directly affect calcium levels.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like, for example, adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone, that can temporarily shift calcium out of the bloodstream,
Oh, wow.
which can potentially contribute to that hyperexcitability that we see in tetany.
That is so cool. I never knew that. It really highlights just how interconnected everything in our bodies is.
Oh, absolutely. And then you have manifest tetany, which is more severe.
Oh, okay.
This is when the calcium levels fall significantly
Okay.
and the symptoms are more pronounced. They're even happening at rest.
Got it.
And it can include things like carpopidal spasm, which is very intense cramping in the hands and feet.
Ooh, that sounds really painful.
Mm.
Are there any diagnostic tests for these different forms of tetany?
Well, yes, absolutely. For latent tetany, doctors often use tests like Chvostek sign and Trousseau sign. Have you heard of those?
I've heard of them, but I don't actually know what they are.
Well, Chvostek sign is really interesting. Basically, what the doctor does is they tap on the facial nerve right in front of the ear.
Hmm.
And if the person has latent tetany, the muscles in their cheek will twitch.
Oh, wow. It's so crazy how, these seemingly simple observations can actually reveal so much about what's going on inside.
It really is, isn't it? And then for Trousseau's sign, what the doctor does is they actually use a blood pressure cuff to restrict blood flow to the hand for a few minutes.
Oh, wait. They're actually restricting blood flow to diagnose this. Is that safe?
Oh, it is safe. It's just temporary.
Oh, okay.
And basically what happens is if the person has latent tetany, this restriction of blood flow is going to trigger a characteristic spasm in the hand.
Wow, so it's almost like a secret code that's revealing that there's a calcium imbalance.
It really is. And then there's another test called herb sign,
Okay.
where they apply a mild electrical current to a nerve. And if the person have latent tetany, their muscles will contract much more easily than expected.
Okay, so they're more sensitive to it. Got it.
Exactly.
So that's fascinating. It sounds like it's really important to catch these issues early on then.
It is, yes.
Especially because you said manifest tetany can be life-threatening.
That's right, yeah. In really severe cases, those muscle spasms can actually affect the larynx, the voice box,
Oh.
leading to something called laryngeal spasm, which can be very dangerous.
So low calcium is definitely something to look out for. But I'm curious about the flip side.
Yeah.
What happens when the body has too much calcium? Does that ever happen?
It certainly does. And that's where we get into a condition called hyperparathyroidism.
Okay.
And this is often caused by a tumor on one of the parathyroid glands.
Okay.
And so this tumor basically leads to an overproduction of PTH.
Right. So too much of our calcium guardian.
Too much of a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And consequently, too much calcium in the blood.
So while calcium is obviously crucial, it sounds like there's a real danger in having too much of it as well.
Definitely a delicate balance.
So what happens then in those cases where there's too much?
So remember how we talked about PTH pulling calcium from the bones?
Right, yeah.
Well, with hyperparathyroidism, this process goes into overdrive.
Oh, no.
And it can lead to weakened bones and an increased risk of fractures. And this condition is actually called osteitis fibrosis cystica.
Osteitis fibrosis cystica. Wow, that sounds pretty serious.
It can be, especially if it's left untreated.
Oh, wow.
And that's just one potential consequence of hypercalcemia, which is that elevated blood calcium.
Okay.
There are a number of other potential issues that can crop up.
Like what?
Well, we're talking things like reduced muscle tone,
Okay.
excessive urination and thirst,
Uh-oh.
and even the formation of kidney stones.
Kidney stones. Ouch.
Yeah, not fun. And those can actually lead to kidney damage over time.
Oh, wow. So it really is all about striking that balance.
Absolutely.
Too little calcium, you risk tetany.
Yeah.
Too much, and then you face a whole other set of problems. But I'm curious, we talked about PTH as the primary regulator here.
Right.
But how does the body ever lower calcium levels? Does it just rely on PTH easing off, or is there something else going on?
Well, PTH is definitely the main player, the conductor of the calcium orchestra, so to speak.
I like that.
But it's not a solo act. There's another important hormone called calcitonin that can actually step in to lower calcium levels when they get too high.
Oh, okay. Calcitonin.
And this one's produced by the thyroid gland, which you might remember has a whole range of responsibilities in the body.
Yeah, that's right. The thyroid's often associated with metabolism, but I guess it clearly has its fingers in other pies as well.
It does, it does.
So tell me more about this calcitonin and how it actually works.
Well, you can think of calcitonin as a counterbalance to PTH. So while PTH mobilizes calcium from the bones, calcitonin does the opposite.
Okay.
It actually inhibits bone breakdown and encourages calcium to be deposited back into the bones.
Oh, so it's putting the brakes on that calcium release.
Exactly. And it also increases calcium excretion through the kidneys, further helping to lower those levels.
So it's like a two-pronged approach,
We-
reducing calcium release and increasing its removal.
Exactly. Very efficient.
But we can't forget about vitamin D in all of this, right? That played a role too, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right to bring that up because while we often think of vitamin D as something that we get from our diet or from sunshine, it's actually what we call a prohormone,
A prohormone.
which means that it can be converted into an active hormone in the body.
Okay.
And that active form, 1025 dihydroxy vitamin D or 1025 DHCC for sure.
Okay, I'm just going to go with 1025 DHCC.
That's actually a key player in calcium absorption.
Okay, so PTH boosts the activation of vitamin D, and then 1025 DHCC is helping to pull calcium from the food we eat into the bloodstream.
Exactly. It's a real tag team effort. And just to clarify, when we talk about vitamin D being activated, we're talking about a series of chemical transformations that have to happen in the body.
Oh, got it. Okay.
It starts with either the vitamin D we ingest from food or the type that our skin produces when we're exposed to sunlight.
Okay.
But both of those forms then need to be processed by the liver and the kidneys to become that active 1025 DHCC hormone.
Wow, so there's like a whole chain of events involved.
Mm.
But that raises a question for me. What if someone isn't getting enough sunlight or enough vitamin D in their diet? Does that automatically mean they're going to have calcium problems?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something to be mindful of. While we can get some vitamin D from foods like fatty fish and fortified dairy products, sunlight exposure is a major source for a lot of people.
Right.
So if you live in a place with limited sunlight, or if you have to cover your skin for cultural or religious reasons, you might need to be more intentional about getting enough vitamin D,
Okay.
either from your diet or maybe by considering a supplement in consultation with your doctor, of course.
Right, yeah. It's like a reminder that there are all these different pieces to this puzzle.
Definitely.
But kind of stepping back a little bit, I'm also curious about other factors that might influence calcium regulation. I know we've talked about diet a bit, but what about things like exercise or stress? Could those play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Lifestyle factors can have a really significant impact on calcium balance.
So, like how?
Well, for example, weight-bearing exercise is essential for maintaining good bone density.
Okay, so that makes sense.
When you engage in activities like walking, running, or lifting weights, you're putting stress on your bones.
Right.
And this actually stimulates them to become stronger and denser.
So it's like use it or lose it for our bones as well as our muscles, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. Another great reason to stay active.
Absolutely. What about the flip side of that? Could too much exercise ever be a problem?
That's a good question.
Huh.
While exercise is generally beneficial, too much of a good thing can sometimes backfire.
Oh.
Particularly for women, excessive exercise can sometimes disrupt hormone balance,
Yeah.
which could potentially affect calcium levels. So it's all about finding that sweet spot.
Right. Balance seems to be the recurring theme here.
It is.
What about stress then? I know we've already talked about how emotional stress can trigger those muscle spasms and tetany,
Right.
but does chronic stress have any kind of long-term impact on calcium regulation?
It can, unfortunately. So when we're chronically stressed, our bodies release higher levels of cortisol,
Right, the stress hormone.
which is a glucocorticoid hormone.
Okay.
And as we mentioned earlier, glucocorticoids can actually interfere with calcium absorption and promote its excretion.
Oh, so it's working against us.
But yeah, it can lead to lower calcium levels over time.
So it's like stress is kind of undoing all our hard work to maintain that calcium balance.
In a way, yeah. And sleep is another important
Oh,
factor.
okay. How so?
Well, during sleep, our bodies are busy repairing and rebuilding tissues. And this includes our bones.
Okay.
So if you're consistently skimping on sleep, that could also have implications for calcium regulation over time.
Wow. It's amazing how interconnected everything is. It's not just about, getting enough calcium in our diet. It's really about creating a lifestyle that supports that whole system.
Exactly, a holistic approach.
But let's go back to the hormones for a moment. We talked about PTH, calcitonin, and that active form of vitamin D. But how do they all work together so seamlessly? Is it just a matter of each hormone kind of doing its own thing?
Well, remember how we talked about PTH boosting the activation of vitamin D?
Right.
Well, that's actually a great example of how these hormones work in concert with each other. So PTH doesn't directly activate vitamin D. It actually stimulates the kidneys to do it.
So the kidneys are involved here too?
Well, the kidneys are absolutely essential.
Okay.
They filter the blood, reabsorbing calcium back into the bloodstream when it's needed, or excreting it in urine when levels are too high.
Okay.
And as we just discussed, they're also responsible for converting vitamin D into its active hormone form.
So the kidneys are like the central processing unit for calcium regulation.
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it.
They're constantly responding to signals from PTH and calcitonin and all these other hormones to fine-tune those calcium levels.
It really is quite remarkable.
Okay, this has been such an eye-opening dive already. I feel like I'm seeing calcium regulation in a whole new light. But with all this intricate interplay, I'm wondering, are there, ways to check if this system's working properly? Are there any specific tests or screenings that, people should consider?
That's a great question, and it's always wise to be proactive about your health, right?
Right.
So regular checkups with your doctor are definitely key.
Okay.
They can assess your overall health and consider your risk factors, and if needed, they can run some basic tests to actually check those calcium levels directly.
So it's not something that, routinely gets checked,
Not necessarily, no.
but it's something that people could talk to their doctors about if they have any concerns.
Absolutely, yeah. And be sure to mention any family history of bone diseases or any symptoms you might be experiencing, that could be related to calcium, like muscle cramps, fatigue, bone pain.
Right, those sorts of things.
It's always better to err on the side of caution.
Definitely. Knowledge is power. And speaking of knowledge, I know you mentioned earlier that there was one more, fascinating aspect of calcium regulation that you wanted to touch on. What was that again?
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. We've talked about PTH, calcitonin, and that active form of vitamin D in maintaining this balance.
Right.
And we even touched upon how lifestyle factors can influence the system.
Yeah.
But there's another layer of regulation that's just as important, these feedback mechanisms.
Feedback mechanism.
Yeah. So imagine like a thermostat in your house. When the temperature drops below a certain set point?
Right.
The thermostat senses this change and turns on the heater.
Yeah.
But then once the temperature rises back up to that desired level, the thermostat says, okay, we're good, and switches the heater off.
Okay.
That's a feedback loop in action. And our bodies use these loops all the time to maintain a stable internal environment. We call it homeostasis.
Right. So it's like a self-regulating system.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah.
And calcium regulation is a perfect example of this. So remember how we talked about PTH being released when those calcium levels are low?
Yeah.
Well, as PTH does its job and those levels start to rise back to normal, that increase in calcium actually signals back to the parathyroid glands.
Oh, okay.
It says, hey, slow down PTH production.
So it's like a built-in brake to prevent things from, overshooting.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to calcitonin. When calcium levels are too high, calcitonin comes in, brings them down.
Okay.
But once those levels return to normal, the thyroid gland gets the message, all right, ease up on the calcitonin production.
Wow. So it's like this constant dance between the hormones, the glands, all orchestrated by these feedback loops.
Very intricate dance, yeah. And it's essential for keeping those calcium levels within that narrow, healthy range we talked about.
It makes you appreciate just how sophisticated our bodies really are.
It really does.
But I am curious, what happens if these feedback mechanisms go wrong? Could that be a factor in, conditions like hyperparathyroidism that we were talking about?
That's a really insightful question because while we've been focusing on how these systems normally function, it's true that malfunctions in those feedback loops can definitely contribute to various calcium disorders.
Hmm.
So for instance, in some cases of hyperparathyroidism, the parathyroid gland might not be responding properly to those feedback signals.
Okay.
And it just keeps churning out excess PTH even when the calcium levels are already elevated.
Oh, wow.
And this can lead to a persistent state of hypercalcemia with all those problems that we talked about.
So it's almost like the brakes are failing.
Yeah, good analogy. The system can't regulate itself properly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights why understanding these feedback loops is so crucial, not just for, understand how our bodies work, but for actually identifying potential points of failure that could contribute to disease.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much. I have like a whole new appreciation for this, how complex but also elegant calcium regulation is.
It has been my pleasure sharing all this with you. And, the more we understand these processes, the better we can take care of ourselves, right?
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want listeners to remember about calcium and how it's regulated?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that calcium balance is a dynamic process. It's a constant interplay between our hormones, organs, and those crucial feedback mechanisms we talked about.
Okay.
It's not just about getting enough calcium in your diet. It's about creating a lifestyle that supports that whole system.
So those lifestyle factors we talked about.
Exactly. Things like exercise, stress management, and being mindful of your vitamin D levels.
Well said. It's been such a pleasure exploring all of this with you today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a delight to, dive deep into these topics.
And to our listeners, we hope this has been informative and engaging. And remember, there's always more to learn, more to discover. Until next time, keep those curious minds active. And thanks for joining us on the deep dive. I'm wondering, with all this intricate interplay, are there ways to check if the system's working properly? Are there any specific tests or screenings that people should consider?
That's a great question. And it's always a good idea to be, proactive when it comes to our health. Regular checkups with your doctor are key.
Okay.
They can assess your overall health, look at any risk factors, and if needed, they can run some basic tests to check those calcium levels.
So it's not something that, routinely gets checked, but it's something that people could talk to their doctors about.
Exactly, especially if they have any concerns. And be sure to mention any family history of bone diseases.
Right.
Or any symptoms you might be experiencing that could, be related.
Like what kinds of symptoms?
Muscle cramps, fatigue, bone pain, those sorts of things. Better safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And speaking of knowledge, you mentioned earlier that there was one more fascinating aspect of calcium regulation that you wanted to touch on. Do you remember what that was?
I do. We've talked about the roles of PTH, calcitonin, vitamin D, all in maintaining that balance.
Right.
And we even touched upon how lifestyle factors can influence things.
Right, yeah.
But there's another layer of regulation that's just as crucial, and that's these feedback mechanisms.
Feedback mechanisms.
Yeah, so imagine like a thermostat in your house. When the temperature drops.
Yeah.
Below a certain set point, the thermostat senses it and turns on the heater.
Right.
But then once the temperature rises back up, to the desired level, it says, okay, we're good, and it switches off.
Right.
That's a feedback loop in action.
Mm-hmm.
And our bodies use these loops all the time to maintain a stable internal environment. Homeostasis, as we call it.
So it's like this self-regulating system.
Precisely. And calcium regulation is a perfect example. Remember we talked about PTH being released when those calcium levels are low.
Yeah.
Well, as it does its job, those levels start rising back to normal. That increase in calcium actually signals back to the parathyroid glands.
Oh, interesting.
And basically tells them, hey, slow down the PTH production.
It's like a built-in brake to prevent things from overshooting.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to calcitonin. When those levels are too high, calcitonin comes in, brings them down.
Right.
But once those levels return to normal, the thyroid gland gets the message, all right, ease up on the calcitonin.
So it's like this constant dance between the hormones, the glands, all orchestrated by these feedback loops.
A very intricate dance, yeah.
Mm.
And it's really essential for keeping those calcium levels in that narrow range, that healthy range we talked about.
It makes you appreciate just how sophisticated our bodies are. But I am curious, what happens if these feedback mechanisms go wrong? Could that be a factor in conditions like, hyperparathyroidism that we were talking about?
That's a very insightful question.
Yeah.
Because while we've been focusing on, how these systems normally function, it's true that malfunctions can happen.
Okay.
And those malfunctions in these feedback loops can definitely contribute to, all sorts of different calcium disorders.
Oh, wow.
For instance, in some cases of hyperparathyroidism, that parathyroid gland might not be responding properly to those signals.
Right.
And it just keeps, churning out that excess PTH,
Even when it doesn't need to.
even when calcium levels are already high. And this can lead to that persistent state of hypercalcemia with all those problems that we discussed.
Right, yeah. It's like those brakes are failing.
Exactly. The system can't regulate itself properly.
Hmm.
And it really underscores why understanding these feedback mechanisms is so crucial, not just for understanding, normal physiology, but also for identifying those potential points of failure, right? The things that can lead to disease.
Absolutely. Well, this has been incredible. I feel like I've learned so much. I have a whole new appreciation for how complex, but also how elegant this whole system of calcium regulation is.
It's been my pleasure to share this with you. And, the more we understand about these processes, the better we can take care of ourselves.
Absolutely. So to wrap up today, what's the one key takeaway you want listeners to remember about calcium and how it's regulated?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this calcium balance, it's a dynamic process, a constant interplay between hormones, organs, and those crucial feedback mechanisms we talked about.
Okay.
It's not just about getting enough calcium in your diet. It's about creating a lifestyle that supports that whole system.
Through those things like exercise, stress management.
Exactly, and being mindful of those vitamin D levels.
Well said. It's been such a pleasure exploring this with you today.
Thank you for having me. Always a delight to dive deep into these topics.
And to our listeners, we hope this has been an informative and engaging journey into this world of calcium regulation. Remember, there's always more to learn, more to discover. Until next time, keep those curious minds active, and thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.